Pamela Smart, trapped in a failing marriage, devised a chilling plan to free herself by seducing and manipulating 15-year-old Billy Flynn and his friends into a deadly conspiracy. On May 1st, 1990, driven by Pamela's insidious influence, Billy and his accomplices brutally ended Gregg Smart's life, staging the scene to look like a botched robbery. Despite Pamela's denials and efforts to mislead the investigation, the truth emerged through relentless police work. Even as she faced the court, Pamela continued to deny responsibility for the murder of her husband, maintaining her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Meanwhile, Billy and his friends, confronted with the gravity of their actions, confessed everything, revealing Pamela's calculated manipulation and the depth of her deceit. In a dramatic courtroom scene, Pamela was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, her freedom stripped away as the full story of her betrayal came to light. This case stands as a stark lesson in the destructive power of manipulation, the consequences of deceit, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Stay tuned as we delve into every harrowing detail. There's much to learn from this tragic and dramatic tale. Pamela Smart met Gregg Smart in the late 1980s during her college years. Pamela was a dynamic, ambitious woman, full of life and dreams. Gregg was a steady, dependable man with a more traditional outlook. Their initial meeting was marked by an undeniable chemistry, a spark that seemed to promise a bright future. Pamela was drawn to Gregg's grounded nature, while Gregg was captivated by Pamela's vivacity and charisma. Their courtship was swift and intense. Pamela and Gregg's romance was the kind of story that felt almost too perfect. They quickly fell in love, their relationship characterized by a whirlwind of shared experiences and deep emotional connections. Pamela, in particular, was enamored with the idea of a fairy tale romance, and Gregg was eager to build a life with her. The proposal came quickly. Gregg, with his traditional values, believed in the sanctity of marriage as a foundation for life. He proposed with heartfelt sincerity, and Pamela, while enthusiastic, was also driven by her desire for stability and the dream of a perfect life. The early days of their marriage were filled with optimism and hope. They settled into a modest home, each bringing their own expectations and dreams into their shared life. Pamela was excited about the future, imagining a life filled with success and fulfillment. Gregg, on the other hand, envisioned a more traditional path, focusing on building a family and maintaining a stable household. However, the contrast in their expectations soon began to show. Pamela's career ambitions and desire for a vibrant social life clashed with Gregg's more conventional plans. She found herself growing restless and frustrated with the limitations of their life together. Gregg, meanwhile, struggled to understand Pamela's dissatisfaction, feeling increasingly inadequate and disconnected. As the months passed, the initial excitement of their marriage began to wane. Pamela's growing frustration became more apparent. She felt trapped in a life that did not align with her ambitious goals and energetic personality. Gregg's more reserved nature and lack of understanding about her needs led to frequent arguments. The couple found themselves caught in a cycle of blame and resentment. Pamela's dissatisfaction was not merely about the daily routines. It was also about the deeper sense of unfulfilled dreams and ambitions. She had envisioned a life filled with excitement and achievement, but found herself instead in a stifling environment that seemed to offer little chance for personal growth. Despite their growing distance, Pamela and Gregg made efforts to salvage their marriage. They attended counseling sessions and tried to communicate more openly. Pamela made attempts to compromise, while Gregg tried to be more supportive and understanding. However, these efforts often fell short. The underlying issues remained unresolved, and the attempts at reconciliation only highlighted the depth of their incompatibility. The emotional strain of their troubled marriage took a toll on both Pamela and Gregg. Pamela's frustration grew as she felt increasingly trapped in a life that did not match her aspirations. Gregg's feelings of inadequacy and helplessness led to further emotional distance between them. As the years went by, the divide between Pamela and Gregg grew more pronounced. Pamela's dissatisfaction with her marriage intensified, leading her to seek solace outside their relationship. She found herself drawn to new experiences and people who seemed to offer the excitement and validation she craved. Gregg, on the other hand, struggled with feelings of betrayal and confusion, unable to understand the reasons behind Pamela's growing discontent. Their relationship became marked by emotional distance and unresolved conflicts. Pamela's pursuit of her own needs and Gregg's inability to meet them created a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. The once promising future they had envisioned together now appeared to be slipping away. By the time Pamela reached the point of seeking drastic measures, the foundation of their marriage was irreparably damaged. Her dissatisfaction and growing frustration set the stage for the dramatic and dangerous decisions she would make in the future. The emotional and psychological strain of their troubled marriage created a fertile ground for manipulation and destructive behavior. In the months following their attempt at reconciliation, Gregg continued to believe they could make things work. From his perspective, their efforts at counseling, the heart-to-heart conversations, and the occasional moments of intimacy seemed like signs that their marriage was slowly healing. He would come home from work, wrapping his arms around Pamela, whispering promises of a better future, and she would nod, her lips forming a smile that never reached her eyes. But inside, Pamela was suffocating. Gregg's affection, instead of reassuring her, made her feel trapped. The very things he offered as tokens of love, his predictable routines, his quiet presence, his steadfastness, were what drove her further into despair. She had imagined a life of excitement, filled with adventure and passion. Instead, she found herself chained to a man who couldn't understand her, in a suburban life that felt dull and lifeless. Pamela began to play the role of the perfect wife, hosting dinners, smiling at social gatherings, and laughing at Gregg's jokes. But behind closed doors, her mask would slip. Every conversation between them became tinged with resentment. When Gregg spoke about starting a family, Pamela would recoil. How could she bring a child into a life she didn't even want to be a part of? Her once vibrant spirit, the part of her that had attracted Gregg to her in the first place, was fading. Pamela's frustration with her life grew into a quiet rage, simmering beneath the surface. To cope with her unhappiness, Pamela turned to the one thing that had always been a source of comfort for her: music and television. She immersed herself in the world of rock music, often fantasizing about the lives of her favorite musicians and rock stars, people who seemed to live with the kind of freedom and excitement she craved. Pamela idolized the wild, carefree lifestyles she saw on TV and in the music videos she consumed. She imagined herself in their shoes, living a life of adventure, far from the mundane existence she shared with Gregg. Her fantasies began to blend with reality. Pamela started to believe that she deserved more than what she had, that the life she was living was beneath her. She became obsessed with the idea that happiness and excitement were just within her reach. If only she could find a way to break free from the chains of her marriage. As their relationship deteriorated, Pamela began to fantasize about a life without Gregg. However, rather than pursuing a divorce or discussing her dissatisfaction with her husband, Pamela chose a more sinister path, one that would shock the world and reveal her manipulative nature. At that time, William Billy Flynn was a 15-year-old boy attending Winnicott High School in Hampton. Like many boys his age, Billy was shy, introverted, and struggling to fit in. Raised by a single mother, Billy lacked a strong father figure in his life, which left him emotionally vulnerable and seeking validation. In 1990, Billy met Pamela Smart, who worked as a media coordinator at his high school. His life changed forever. Pamela was 22 years old, attractive, charismatic, and confident. She stood out to Billy as someone much more mature and experienced, and he quickly became infatuated with her. What started as a student-teacher dynamic soon evolved into something far more dangerous. Pamela, who was unhappy in her marriage to Gregg, began using her position of authority to manipulate Billy into a romantic relationship. Over time, she showered him with affection, making him feel important and loved. For Billy, the attention he received from Pamela was intoxicating. He had never experienced anything like it before. This dynamic of power and vulnerability made him an easy target for Pamela's manipulation. As their relationship deepened, Pamela began sharing her marital troubles with Billy. She confided in him that her husband Gregg was controlling and that she felt trapped in her marriage. While this may have been exaggerated to win Billy's sympathy, it worked. Billy, desperate to please Pamela and to continue receiving her love, believed every word she said. Pamela had now firmly planted herself in Billy's mind as a damsel in distress, someone he needed to save from a life of misery. It wasn't long before she began hinting that the only way they could be together was if Gregg was out of the picture, permanently. Pamela painted Gregg as the enemy. Billy was silent, his mind struggling to process what Pamela was suggesting. He didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to believe that the woman he loved could be thinking such dark thoughts. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the growing sense of excitement in his chest. If Gregg were gone, he and Pamela could be together. They could live the life they had both dreamed of. Pamela didn't push the issue further that night, but the damage was done. The idea had been planted in Billy's mind, and it would only take a little more nudging for it to grow into something far more dangerous. Over the next few weeks, Pamela continued to manipulate Billy, subtly reinforcing the idea that Gregg was the only thing standing in the way of their happiness. She would talk about how trapped she felt, how Gregg controlled every aspect of her life, and how she wished she could just escape from him. Billy, desperate to help the woman he loved, became more and more convinced that something needed to be done. Pamela, ever the skilled manipulator, knew exactly how to play on Billy's emotions. She would cry in front of him, telling him how much she loved him, but how impossible it was for them to be together as long as Gregg was still in the picture. She made Billy believe that he was her only hope, the only person who could save her from the prison she was trapped in. Billy, overwhelmed by his love for Pamela and blinded by his desire to be her hero, began to seriously consider the unthinkable. He couldn't bear the thought of Pamela living in misery, and the idea of a life without Gregg started to seem not just possible, but necessary. Pamela and Billy's relationship took a dark and forbidden turn, shifting from a mentor-student dynamic to an illicit love affair. As the school's media coordinator, Pamela was responsible for overseeing the students' work in broadcasting and media projects. Billy, who was part of this program, admired Pamela's professionalism, but over time, admiration turned into infatuation. Pamela took advantage of her role as a mentor to cross ethical boundaries. She groomed Billy by showering him with affection and attention, making him feel special and needed. She slowly gained control over him by sharing personal details of her marriage and portraying herself as a victim of an emotionally abusive husband. Billy, already emotionally vulnerable, saw Pamela as someone he needed to protect. Gregg, ever the optimist, still believed that their marriage could be salvaged. He tried to engage Pamela in conversations about their future, suggesting they take a vacation or start making plans for a family. But Pamela, consumed by her obsession with escaping, barely paid him any attention. She would nod absent-mindedly as Gregg spoke, her mind already elsewhere, plotting her way out. Gregg, in his own quiet way, was suffering. He didn't understand what had gone wrong, didn't know why the woman he loved had become so distant, so unreachable. He blamed himself, wondering if he had done something to drive Pamela away. He tried to be patient, to give her space, but the uncertainty was eating away at him. In his heart, Gregg feared that their marriage was beyond saving, but he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Pamela, on the other hand, had already given up. She had made her decision. The only way out of her marriage was through Gregg's death. And with Billy Flynn so firmly under her control, She knew that the plan was already in motion. Billy Flynn was a 15-year-old boy whose life had been turned upside down. What had started as a teenage crush on an older woman had spiraled into something far more dangerous and sinister. Pamela Smart had become the center of Billy's universe, and he would do anything for her, anything to keep her love, anything to make her happy. Billy's home life was a stark contrast to the world he shared with Pamela. At home, he was just another teenager, struggling with school, dealing with the usual challenges of adolescence, and trying to find his place in the world. His parents, while caring, didn't understand the emotional turmoil Billy was going through. They saw him as a good kid, responsible and well-behaved. They had no idea that their son had been drawn into a deadly web of manipulation and deceit. At school, Billy's friends began to notice a change in him. He was more withdrawn, more secretive. He would disappear for long periods, sneaking off to meet Pamela in secret. When he was with his friends, he seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. The carefree, easygoing boy they had once known was now tense and anxious, as if carrying a heavy burden. Billy knew what Pamela wanted him to do. He had known it from the moment she first hinted at the idea of getting rid of Gregg. But now that the moment was drawing closer, the reality of what he was about to do began to sink in. Billy was no killer. He had never been in a fight, let alone taken a life. The thought of actually going through with the plan filled him with dread.
But every time Billy began to have doubts, Pamela was there to reassure him, to remind him of why they were doing this. She would tell him how much she loved him, how much better their lives would be once Gregg was out of the picture. She would stroke his hair, kiss his cheek, and whisper sweet promises in his ear. And Billy, desperate to keep Pamela's love, would push his doubts aside and focus on the plan. Pamela had become Billy's entire world, and in his mind, the only way to keep that world from falling apart was to do what she asked. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, couldn't imagine his life without her. And so, despite the fear and the guilt gnawing at his conscience, Billy committed himself to the plan. Billy Flynn wasn't alone in this deadly plot. Pamela's manipulation extended beyond just Billy. She had drawn two of his friends, Patrick Randall and Vance Latham Jr., into the plan as well. Both boys, like Billy, were young, impressionable, and eager to prove themselves. They had become part of the group through a mix of peer pressure, manipulation, and a desire to be part of something bigger than themselves. Patrick Randall was a tough kid, known for his rebellious attitude and his willingness to take risks. He wasn't afraid to break the rules, and he enjoyed the thrill of danger. But despite his tough exterior, Patrick was still just a teenager, easily influenced by the people around him. Billy had confided in Patrick about his relationship with Pamela, and Patrick, eager to be part of something exciting, had agreed to help with the plan. Vance Latham Jr., on the other hand, was more cautious. He wasn't as rebellious as Patrick, but he was loyal to his friends. When Billy and Patrick approached him with the plan, Vance was hesitant. He didn't like the idea of getting involved in something so serious, but he didn't want to let his friends down. Vance's father owned a gun, and Billy and Patrick convinced him to steal it for the plan. Reluctantly, Vance agreed, and the three boys began to put their plan into motion. Pamela, for her part, played her role perfectly. She was the mastermind behind the plan, but she kept her distance, making sure that the boys were the ones taking the risks. She would meet with them in secret, giving them instructions, reassuring them that everything would go smoothly. Pamela's calm demeanor and confidence in the plan gave the boys a false sense of security. They believed that Pamela had everything under control, that they were just doing what needed to be done. The secrecy of their relationship added to its allure. They would meet in hidden places, away from prying eyes, and the thrill of sneaking around only fueled Billy's obsession with Pamela. She had become the center of his world, and he was willing to do anything to keep her in his life, even if it meant committing murder. Pamela's manipulation was calculated and deliberate. She would alternately praise Billy for his devotion and then guilt him into feeling responsible for her unhappiness. Over time, Billy became convinced that he had no other option but to follow through with Pamela's plan to unplug Gregg from life. Pamela had succeeded in turning Billy from a love-struck teenager into a willing participant in a murder plot. Pamela had fully convinced Billy that to reboot her husband was the only way for them to be together. The murder plot, however, wasn't something that happened overnight. It was carefully orchestrated by Pamela, who used her position of authority over Billy and his friends to manipulate them into carrying out her plan. Billy enlisted the help of his friends, Patrick Randall and Vance Latham Jr., both of whom were also teenagers and easily influenced by Billy's charisma and loyalty. Like Billy, they saw themselves as part of something larger, a mission to help their friend and to free Pamela from her unhappy marriage. They were drawn into the plot, unaware of the full consequences of their actions. Pamela continued to play the role of the helpless victim, feeding Billy and his friends stories of how Gregg mistreated her. She made them believe that her life was in danger and that the only way she could be free was if Gregg was dead. Over time, the boys' initial reluctance turned into determination as they planned out the murder. Pamela instructed Billy and his friends to make the murder look like a botched robbery. This way, no one would suspect her of being involved, and they could avoid getting caught. The plan was set. They would enter Gregg and Pamela's home when Pamela was away, shut down Gregg for eternity, and make the house look like a burglary gone wrong. The boys, inexperienced, believed that they could pull off the perfect crime. However, they had little understanding of the complexities of criminal investigations or the psychological toll that murder would take on them. They were caught in Pamela's web, blinded by their loyalty to her and their desire to please her. In truth, Pamela was nervous. The closer they got to the day of the murder, the more anxious she became. But she couldn't let the boys see her fear. She needed them to believe that everything was going according to plan, that there was no turning back. Billy, as the one closest to Pamela, was the most emotionally invested in the plan. He was terrified, but he knew that there was no turning back now. Patrick, always the tough one, tried to keep his cool, but even he was beginning to feel the weight of what they were about to do. Killing someone wasn't a game, and the reality of taking a life was starting to sink in. But Patrick wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to let Billy or Vance see his fear. Vance, on the other hand, was having second thoughts. He hadn't wanted to be part of the plan in the first place, and now that the moment was drawing closer, he was starting to panic. But it was too late to back out. The night before the murder, Billy met with Pamela one last time. They sat in her car, parked in a secluded spot, the air between them thick with tension. Pamela, sensing Billy's fear, took his hand in hers and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "After tomorrow, everything will be different. We'll be free, Billy. We'll be together, just like we've always wanted." Billy nodded, but his heart was pounding in his chest. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that everything would be okay. But deep down, he knew that nothing would ever be the same after tomorrow. Billy's mind raced as Pamela's words hung in the air. He had heard her promises before, the same soothing reassurances that had once filled him with excitement and anticipation. But now, on the eve of the act they could never undo, he felt the weight of her words like a heavy chain pulling him down. Pamela's eyes glistened in the dim light, reflecting a strange mix of affection and determination. To her, this wasn't just an end to her unhappy marriage. It was the beginning of the life she had dreamed about. Free from Gregg, free from the suffocating restraints of their relationship. But to Billy, it felt different. He couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread building up inside him. As they sat in silence, the enormity of what lay ahead pressed down on Billy like a crushing weight. His mind flashed through images of what the next day would bring. The confrontation, the act itself, the finality of it all. He had never imagined his life would take such a dark turn. He was only 15, still just a kid, but now he was caught in something far beyond his control. Billy swallowed hard, feeling the pressure of her words tighten around his chest. Pamela had a way of making him feel needed, important in a way he had never experienced before. But now, that need felt like a burden, a chain pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape. He wanted to be strong for her, to be the person she believed he was. But as the minutes ticked by, his resolve wavered. Could he really go through with this? Could he take another man's life, even for the woman he loved? That night, Billy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as his mind raced. Sleep wouldn't come. How could it, with the enormity of tomorrow's plan looming over him? His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Billy's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. He had convinced himself that this was the right thing to do, that it was the only way to be with Pamela. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about love. This was about control. About Pamela's control over him, and the way she had used that control to manipulate him into doing something unthinkable. The more he thought about it, the more Billy's stomach churned with fear and doubt. But it was too late to turn back now. He had made a promise to Pamela, and no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't break it. The morning of May 1st, 1990, Billy woke early, his body exhausted from the restless, sleepless night. But his mind was sharp, almost too aware of what lay ahead. He glanced at the clock on his nightstand, feeling as though it ticked louder than usual, each passing minute a reminder that the decision he had made could not be undone. His nerves were raw, his heart pounding in a constant, erratic rhythm. Today, he had to carry out the plan Pamela had so carefully constructed. He had promised her, and breaking that promise would mean losing her, and that to him was unthinkable. For many, it was just another day, a mundane start filled with the regular motions of life. But for Billy Flynn and his accomplices, it was the day that would change everything. The day had arrived when Pamela Smart's plan would take its final, irreparable step. Billy sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like an oppressive force. He knew what had to be done, but part of him hoped, naively, that maybe something would happen to stop it all. Maybe Pamela would call and say she had changed her mind, that there was another way. Maybe he could get through the day without taking that terrible step. But he knew that was just wishful thinking. There was no turning back now. Across town, Pamela Smart's day began like any other. She moved through her morning routine with an almost eerie calm, a woman who had already compartmentalized the events that were about to take place. To Pamela, this was simply the final step in her plan. Soon, Gregg would be gone, and she would be free to live the life she wanted, untethered by the man she had grown to despise. She had spun her web carefully, playing her role as the grieving wife, and soon everything would fall into place. Gregg, of course, had no idea of the danger he was in. He had his suspicions about Pamela's fidelity, but he didn't believe his life was at risk. He went about his morning as usual, unaware that it would be his last. Billy spent the better part of the day in a haze of anxiety and dread. He met with his friends, Pete Randall and J.R. Latham, who would help him carry out the plan. They were all jittery, nervous, and uncertain, but the momentum had already taken hold. Pamela's influence over Billy extended to them as well, as they had become entangled in the plan through Billy's involvement. The weight of what they were about to do hung over them like a storm cloud, but none of them knew how to back out without facing Pamela's wrath or disappointment. As the afternoon stretched on, they went over the plan one final time. That night, May 1st, 1990, was quiet in Derry, New Hampshire. The streets were empty, and most of the town had settled into a peaceful evening. But for Billy Flynn, Patrick Randall, and Vance Latham Jr., the night was far from ordinary. This was the night they had been preparing for, the night they would carry out Pamela Smart's plan. Pamela had instructed them on what to do. They were to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Gregg was to be terminated, but it had to appear random, something that would absolve Pamela of any suspicion. The details were cold, calculated, and final. Billy was quiet as they talked. His mind was racing with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He thought about Pamela, about how this was supposed to be for her, for their future. But a part of him, deep inside, knew that nothing about this felt right. But it was too late for second thoughts now. The plan was in motion, and there was no stopping it. They knew what they had to do, and yet it all felt surreal. How had it come to this? How had they, a group of teenagers, become part of something so monstrous? But Pamela had woven her web so tightly around them, especially Billy, that they felt there was no escape. They reached the door, the world around them eerily quiet. The plan was simple. Billy and Pete would go inside, while JR would stay outside as the lookout. They would wait for Gregg, and when he arrived, they would carry out the murder and make it look like a burglary gone wrong. Pamela had made it sound almost easy, but now that they were standing there, the reality was suffocating. Billy's hands were shaking, and he had never done anything like this before, never imagined he would be in this position. His heart was pounding in his chest, the sound of it echoing in his ears as they waited. And then, just as planned, Gregg arrived home. Gregg Smart, unaware that his life was about to end. He had no reason to suspect that anything was wrong, but to Billy, this was the moment, the point of no return. Inside the living room, Gregg was lounging on the couch, watching TV. He had no reason to expect danger, no hint that his life was about to be violently interrupted. Gregg barely had time to register the danger before Pete and Billy confronted him. There was no warning, no opportunity for Gregg to defend himself. Billy raised the gun, his hands trembling as his heart raced. Everything was happening so fast, too fast, and he wasn't sure if he could do it. But then he thought of Pamela, her face, her voice, her promises. He had to do this, for her. With a surge of adrenaline, Billy pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot rang through the air, sharp and final. Gregg crumpled to the floor, the life draining out of him in an instant. The reality of what they had just done hit Billy like a wave, overwhelming him with a mix of shock and horror. It was done. Gregg Smart was dead. For a moment, everything was still. The boys stood there, staring at the lifeless body on the floor, the weight of what they had just done crashing down on them. There was no going back now. They had crossed the line, and nothing would ever be the same again. Once the initial shock had passed, the boys quickly set about staging the scene as a robbery. They ransacked the house, tossing furniture and scattering items across the room to make it look like a burglary gone wrong. They took a few items, like jewelry and cash, to make the scene more convincing. The goal was to make it appear as though Gregg had been the unfortunate victim of a random home invasion. Billy, still in a state of shock, went through the motions mechanically. His thoughts were a blur, torn between guilt, fear, and the lingering hope that this would all somehow lead to the life Pamela had promised him. Patrick and Vance worked quickly, eager to get out of the house and away from the scene. The longer they stayed, the more dangerous it became. Once they were satisfied that the scene looked sufficiently staged, the boys left the house through the back door, just as they had entered. They walked quickly back to their car, their hearts racing as they drove away from the Smart residence. In the hours following the murder, Billy felt a strange mixture of emotions. He was relieved that it was over, but at the same time, he was consumed by a deep sense of dread. The weight of what he had done was unbearable. He had taken a life, something he could never undo. No matter what Pamela had promised him, no matter how much he had believed in their love, the reality of what had happened was far more devastating than he had imagined. When Pamela heard the news, she played the role of the grieving widow with chilling precision. She cried, she mourned, she acted every part that was expected of her. To the outside world, she was a woman who had just lost her husband in a tragic, senseless act of violence. But behind, she was already looking ahead to the life she had envisioned, the life she had orchestrated through manipulation and deceit. Billy, on the other hand, was falling apart. The weight of what he had done was too much to bear, and the guilt was eating him alive. He had killed a man for Pamela, but instead of the freedom she had promised, he felt more trapped than ever. The fear, the shame, it was all consuming him, and he didn't know how to make it stop. Pamela, meanwhile, continued to manipulate Billy, keeping him close, reassuring him that everything would be okay. She told him that they were safe, that no one would ever suspect them. But Billy knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Pamela was, not at the house when the events unfolded, but she was far from innocent. When she received the call from Billy, confirming that the plan had been executed, her response was eerily calm. Pamela thanked Billy for what he had done, once again assuring him that everything would be fine. In her mind, she had just secured her freedom, and with Gregg gone, she could finally start the life she had dreamed of. She didn't rush home to check on the scene. Instead, she maintained her carefully crafted alibi, attending the work meeting and making sure she was seen by as many people as possible. Pamela was playing the long game, and she knew that appearing too eager to return home would only raise suspicion. Pamela was already putting the next phase of her plan into action. She arrived home later that night, feigning shock and grief when she discovered Gregg's body. She called the police, her voice filled with panic, and told them that she had come home to find her husband murdered. When the police arrived, Pamela played the role of the grieving widow perfectly. She sobbed as she told them how much she loved her husband, how she had no idea who could have done such a terrible thing. She even provided them with a list of possible suspects, people who might have had a motive to rob their home or harm Gregg. At first, the police had no reason to suspect Pamela. She seemed like a devoted wife, heartbroken over the loss of her husband. The scene appeared to be a clear case of a home invasion gone wrong, and there was little evidence to suggest otherwise. The police began their investigation into Gregg Smart's murder. At first, it seemed like they were looking at the case as a simple burglary gone wrong, just as Pamela had hoped. But soon, cracks in the plan began to appear. As the investigation progressed, cracks in Pamela's story began to emerge. Suspicion started to build around the people closest to Gregg, particularly Pamela. The police noticed inconsistencies in her story, small details that didn't add up. And as they dug deeper, they began to uncover the web of manipulation and deceit that Pamela had spun. The teenagers who had carried out the murder were not seasoned criminals, and it wasn't long before the pressure began to weigh on them. Billy, consumed by guilt, struggled to keep up the facade. He had killed for Pamela, but now the reality of what he had done was too much to bear. It didn't take long for the police to start connecting the dots, piecing together the relationships between Pamela, Billy, and the others involved. And as they closed in, the truth began to unravel. Pamela's carefully constructed plan was falling apart, and soon there would be no escaping the consequences. Despite her outward display of grief, Pamela's behavior in the days following Gregg's murder raised suspicions. While she had initially seemed devastated by her husband's death, those closest to her began to notice that her grief appeared to be short-lived. Within days, Pamela was back at work, attending meetings and social events as if nothing had happened. The police began to question Pamela's involvement. They found it strange that there had been no signs of forced entry at the Smart residence, suggesting that the killer had either been let in or had known where to find the hidden key. As they dug deeper into Pamela's life, they discovered her relationship with Billy Flynn, a relationship that quickly became the focus of their investigation. Billy, meanwhile, was struggling to cope with the emotional aftermath of the murder. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and the pressure of keeping such a dark secret was more than he could handle. Pamela had promised him a future together, but as the days passed, it became clear that the reality was far different from the fantasy she had painted. Pamela's manipulation, which had once seemed so powerful, began to lose its hold on Billy. The cracks in her carefully constructed persona were starting to show, and Billy, overwhelmed with guilt, found himself questioning everything. Gregg Smart's murder were suffocating for the boys involved: Billy Flynn, Pete Randall, and J.R. Latham. The adrenaline that had fueled them through those terrifying moments on the night of May 1st, 1990, had long since faded. Now, all that was left was guilt, fear, and a nagging sense of doom. None of them had fully grasped the gravity of what they had done until now. Billy, though in love with Pamela Smart, couldn't escape the recurring nightmares of that night. The sound of the gun, the sight of Gregg falling. His heart ached not only from what he had done, but from the realization that Pamela, the woman he thought he would be with forever, had distanced herself once the deed was done. Pete Randall and J.R. Latham, on the other hand, were beginning to crack under the pressure. They hadn't been in love with Pamela. They hadn't wanted this. They were just kids caught up in something they didn't understand, swept along by the force of Billy's passion and Pamela's manipulations. Their bond of secrecy was fragile, and it wasn't long before it shattered. Secrets begin to spread. The weight of the murder hung over Pete and JR like a cloud, darkening everything. Pete, who had been Billy's closest accomplice, found himself confiding in one of his friends, unable to keep the truth inside any longer. It was a small confession, a slip of the tongue, but it set off a chain reaction that would change everything. Rumors started circulating in the high school. The students were talking. Some said they had overheard Pete mention the murder. Others said JR had hinted at Billy's involvement with Pamela Smart. The secret that had seemed so well hidden was now unraveling, bit by bit. The students at Winnicott High couldn't believe it at first. How could someone like Billy Flynn, who was quiet and reserved, have committed such a brutal act? And what about Pamela Smart? She had been their media coordinator, their teacher. Could she really have orchestrated the murder of her own husband? It was only a matter of time before one of the students, disturbed by the rumors and unable to keep the information to themselves, decided to approach the police. The student wasn't entirely sure if what they had heard was true, but it was enough to raise alarm bells. They relayed everything they had overheard: the whispers, the confessions, the names. The police were immediately intrigued, but they needed more than teenage gossip. They knew they had to tread carefully. Could these boys really have been manipulated into killing a man? And more importantly, could Pamela Smart, a 22-year-old teacher, really be the mastermind behind it all? But they needed more proof. Without concrete evidence, they couldn't make an arrest. The suspicions alone weren't enough. That's when their attention turned to Cecilia Pierce. Cecilia had been Pamela's intern, a young girl who had looked up to Pamela as both a mentor and a friend. If anyone knew what was going on, it was her. The police needed Cecilia to talk, to confirm what they were beginning to suspect: that Pamela Smart had manipulated these boys, seduced Billy Flynn, and used her influence to have her husband murdered. Cecilia was terrified. She had been caught in the middle of a deadly game without even realizing it. But deep down, she knew that something had been wrong all along. Pamela had confided in her about her affair with Billy. Pamela had even hinted before the murder that she wanted to be free of Gregg. The police questioned Cecilia, gently at first, then more firmly as they realized she was withholding information. Finally, Cecilia broke, her voice trembling. She admitted that Pamela had talked about wanting Gregg gone. She had spoken of a future with Billy Flynn, free from the constraints of her marriage. It was enough. With Cecilia's testimony, the police now had a direct link between Pamela Smart and the murder plot. The walls were closing in on Pamela. On a sunny afternoon, police officers knocked on Pamela Smart's door. She opened it, her usual calm demeanor in place, unaware that her carefully crafted world was about to collapse. The officers informed her that she was being arrested for the murder of her husband, Gregg Smart. Pamela's face paled. For a moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, as if the reality of the situation hadn't fully hit her. But then, her composure returned, and she protested her innocence, insisting that she had nothing to do with the crime. As she was led out in handcuffs, the small crowd that had gathered outside watched in shock. Neighbors whispered, reporters snapped photos, and the world around her seemed to crumble. The media quickly descended on the story, labeling it the Pamela Smart case. Despite her outward composure, Pamela knew that everything was spiraling out of her control. The boys had confessed. Cecilia had given them up. The police had their proof, or so they thought. But Pamela was determined to fight. The trial of Pamela Smart was like something out of a movie. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers. The media attention was relentless, with every detail of Pamela's life being dissected in the press. She had become a symbol of betrayal and manipulation, a woman who had allegedly used her sexuality and power to convince teenage boys to kill for her. As the trial progressed, the prosecution laid out their case with chilling detail. They presented Cecilia's testimony, revealing how Pamela had confided in her about the affair and her desire to be free of Gregg. But the most damning evidence came from the boys themselves. Billy Flynn, the young boy who had once been so deeply in love with Pamela, took the stand. His voice was shaky, but his words were clear. He recounted how Pamela had seduced him, how she had told him that the only way they could be together was if Gregg was out of the picture. Billy confessed to pulling the trigger, but he insisted that Pamela had orchestrated the entire plan. Pete Randall followed, his guilt heavy in his voice. He admitted his involvement, but like Billy, he pointed the finger at Pamela. It was her plan, her manipulation that had led them all down this dark path. Pamela sat stone-faced through their testimonies, denying everything. She maintained that Billy had acted on his own, driven by his own obsession with her. She claimed she had never asked him to kill her husband, never encouraged the boys to commit such a heinous act. But the jury didn't believe her. The evidence was too overwhelming, the confessions too detailed. The image of Pamela as a seductress, manipulating young boys to do her bidding, was too powerful to ignore. The weight of the evidence was crushing, and the confessions were impossibly detailed. Pamela Smart's image as a manipulative seductress, preying on impressionable young boys to carry out her dark desires, was too potent to dismiss. The trial concluded with a conviction that reverberated across the nation. Pamela Smart was found guilty of being an accomplice to first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and witness tampering. The judge's sentence was a life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate as unforgiving as it was final. Billy Flynn, the boy who had pulled the trigger, was sentenced to 40 years behind bars. Pete Randall, who had schemed and executed the heinous crime, received the same sentence. Both young men, barely past their teenage years, were doomed to languish in prison for the majority of their lives. As the gavel came down, Pamela's facade of composure shattered. Inside, she was a tempest of unraveling despair. She had bet everything, her career, her freedom, and her dreams, on a gamble that had ended in catastrophic failure. The life she had so desperately sought, so ruthlessly pursued, was now forever out of reach. Pamela Smart's story is one of profound betrayal, ruthless manipulation, and the devastating fallout of deceit. It began with an affair, a desperate woman seeking an escape from a failing marriage, and spiraled into the brutal murder of an innocent man. The true tragedy lies in how it ensnared and ruined so many young lives. Billy Flynn and Pete Randall, just teenagers, were ensnared by the dark influence of someone they should have been able to trust. They were pawns in a deadly game they barely understood until it was too late. And Gregg Smart, the unwitting victim, lost his life because his wife craved more than her marriage could offer. In a harrowing twist, after decades of denying her guilt, Pamela Smart has come forward in 2024 to take responsibility for her husband's murder. Her confession brings a chilling finality to a saga of tragedy and deception. If this deeply emotional and gripping story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. How did this heart-wrenching tale of betrayal and remorse impact you? Your feedback is invaluable in helping us bring more compelling narratives to light.